one of the things that you're fearful of sometimes is changing into a different person, evolving into a different life stage where you have to make different decisions about who you are. Like the idea of leaving a marriage, which seems on one level secure, conventional, something that society approves of, into the big, wide world where you're not quite sure what you're going to paint on your blank canvas next. That's a scary place to be, but it's also a growth opportunity.
It is. It's a massive growth opportunity, and there's opportunity cost to not taking it. And I suppose that's part of what we're looking at here is the analogy I often use around, imagine yourself standing with one foot on a platform and one foot on the train. In that moment...
Painful.
Really painful.
Yeah, when that train goes.
And I tell you what, they don't like it. People shouting at you to get back from the yellow lines.
Yeah, exactly.
Nobody needs it, but in this imaginary situation, that's a space in which you haven't let that train go. You haven't said goodbye to something that might be right for you, but equally, you haven't committed to it. You're still straddling these different potentials, these different what-ifs. And sometimes we get stuck in this idea that we must maintain that potential for fear of a permanent, one-way only, forever decision. That actually the reality of life is we need to sometimes let a train go, and that train might be a marriage, that train might be a job, that train might be a friendship, in order to feel what is it like actually with both feet on the platform now, committing to that decision. Not necessarily forever, and it doesn't mean it was right, it might have been a mistake, if indeed there is such a thing. Or what happens if we get on that train and put both feet firmly on to find out where it takes us, safe in the knowledge that we can get off at the next stop. Or we can decide to change trains, change platforms. I think the worst thing we can do is get caught in that place where we're spinning our wheels and burning through fuel, but we're not in gear, so we go nowhere.
Just to really extend the travel metaphor.
Please do.
I had the great privilege of interviewing Elliot Page a few months ago, and he said this thing that Drew Barrymore had told him, where he was considering whether to go on a trip and to take an opportunity or take an acting job. And Drew Barrymore said this thing. She was like, you're an adult, so you always have the keys in your pocket. You always have the ability to get up and leave as an adult. And I thought that that was so powerful, particularly because Drew Barrymore, as a child star, often didn't have that opportunity. And that idea that you can always decide to get off the train is not while it's moving, but is a very, very powerful one, because then it enables you to inhabit both thinking spaces. So what would happen if this thing went right?
Yep.
And what would happen if it went wrong? Well, I'd get off the train at the next station.
Yeah.
But I would love to talk to you about decisions that came up for you when we were thinking about this as a topic. And I wonder if one of them might have been your decision to become a therapist.
True, yeah. And was that even a decision? I think back at that stage of my life, bearing in mind I was in my early 20s, I had left university, I had taken a graduate scheme at Procter & Gamble, I'd gone into a sales and marketing career. I had no idea of becoming a therapist until I got to the point where it felt like events were just happening. I found myself actually driving to work on the A3, and I had tears that were so heavy I couldn't see the road. And I was thinking, why? What is this? I later came to understand that's what we call burnout. See episode on burnout of Better in Therapy. But in that moment, I had to recognize that there was something really not working for me about the situation that I was in. I was really stressed. Fast forward through a series of employee assistance programs, short-term counseling, some personal development courses, some weekend training. And I actually found myself entering a retraining, entering a longer-term psychotherapeutic training, still not really with the intention of becoming a therapist. And I was pregnant with my first child when I actually qualified. This was a strange experience that suddenly I found myself still working in sales and marketing, but with a qualification in therapy. And I think what's interesting is that I closed my eyes and drifted onto the train. Again, very dangerous, not recommended. But now I have much more clarity about how to make decisions with our eyes open. And I think what I knew, at least a part of me knew, was that I can't stay on that platform and I can't actually hold this position without some serious damage to myself. So would I drift into therapy again? Maybe I would. People often say to me, how do you become a therapist? Because I've got a career, or I've got a kind of responsibilities, I need to pay my rent. And one of the beautiful things about therapy and retraining as a therapist is that you can do it alongside your life. If anything, I would say, go for it, because if nothing else, it's a fascinating journey of personal development and discovery.
Let's talk about a more conscious decision that I know you made, which was about where to live, which is something that is like highly relatable, because it feels that there is so much hanging on that in terms of future happiness, fulfillment, what's right for your loved ones. And that's a decision that you had to make during lockdown, I think, wasn't it? Yeah.
It was. I actually had COVID for the first time. And what happened was I slept in
Always a good time to make really key life decisions.
So.
Yeah. When you've got brain fog and you're feeling really ill.
It wasn't even in the brain fog stage. I was in the like full sweaty fever stage.
Yeah.
And I stumbled down the stairs when the kind of fugue broke. And I said to my husband, I found this on Rightmove and it's a house in Southsea, I think we should move. And bearing in mind we lived in a totally different city at that point, and our children were in school, he was commuting to a job nearby, I had a practice, a therapy practice. He said, well, perhaps you should have a hot Ribena and go back to bed. I said, no, let's go and see the house. And actually, maybe you're right. Maybe you do need to have a certain level of distress in your body for you to become really open to the idea that things could change, they could be different. So in that situation, there were so many factors to that decision. There was whether or not I actually wanted to disrupt our children and move them from schools that they were happy in, with friendship groups that they felt settled in, whether we wanted to move house. I'd lived in that house. I'd had my children in that house. I'd had a family there that had grown up. I was really attached to that space, but also whether I was going to move my practice. And if I'm honest, that was probably the biggest part of that decision. And you know that I had offices in Winchester where I saw people face to face. Obviously in the pandemic, that ended overnight. All of my work moved to Zoom. And again, suddenly I was afforded this opportunity to stay working remotely. It was really painful to leave that private practice, actually, because these were relationships that mattered to me, that I was seeing face to face on a weekly basis. And I had that 1 week from hell when it was my wrapping up with a dozen clients in 1 week, for whom each of them was experiencing an ending, a significant ending. And I went home on the Friday floored by 12 really important endings with really important people. But the decision paid off. The decision was right. It just, as with all things, came with feelings.
And I think that's such a good point, that a decision will often involve an ending. And simply because you are sad about something does not mean it's wrong. In fact, very often it can mean it's the right thing, because you're feeling an appropriate level of sadness that you're leaving this situation that was healthy and equitable and loving in many ways and full of growth, but you also are able to appreciate that the time is right for both of you to evolve. That's definitely how we felt about Best Friend Therapy ending, that obviously we're both sad about it and we've both had our own ways of dealing with that.
What are they?
We spoke about this week. Your way is to go very quiet and Scandinavian. And
I put it in a box in the woods and I bury it.
And it does not exist. and it appears, these are your words, it appears slightly secretive. So then my way of dealing with it is just to keep frantically busy. I'm just extremely busy and I'm working really hard and I don't have time to think about it. But when I did think about it, I started to feel really insecure that Emma was keeping secrets from me. And then I was like, I'm losing her and she's going out into the big wide world and other people will love her and take her from me. And that's how I dealt with it. But then the amazing thing was, and this is why our friendship is so precious to both of us, that Emma worked that all out and left me this incredible voice note a couple of days ago being like, now, I think this is what's happening. And I'd been obsessing over one thing I'd said about you. About you, so Freudian slip. I'd been obsessing about one thing I'd said to you that I had worried, had landed wrongly, and you couldn't even remember it. You're like, no, it's fine. Anyway, you sent me a 16-minute voice note, had a lovely listen to that. And I was like, oh my gosh, she's so right. She's identified everything. And then I was able to send a voice note of equal length back being like, that's so true. And this is what's happening to me.
Competition. See the episode of Best Friend
Equal
Therapy.
length, anyway. But there was a point that I was going to make before we got into that rabbit hole, which is about
how we deal with it differently.
Yes, but also about the power of disruption.
Yes.
That there is so much growth in disruption, which goes back to what we said at the very start of this evening about the fact that when you started Best Friend Therapy, that was a disruption for you, and it was a risk that you took. Because Emma is an amazing therapist and so boundaried and discreet and brilliant at what she does, she was anxious about putting herself into a kind of public forum where you might be expected to open up a bit more about yourself. And actually, I think you discovered that that was one of the things that listeners really, really valued. I know that I did. But that felt uncomfortable and disruptive.
Yeah.
But ultimately, there is so much creativity that lies within that.
Completely. And I think, you've nailed that, because that decision for me was about, do I want to feel safe or do I want to be secure? And I couldn't feel secure if I kept this quiet lane, controlled, restrained, singular way of being. It felt safe, but it could never be secure.
That is such a good teachable moment, as Oprah would say. The difference between safety and security.
Yeah. I think there's something about recognizing that in these conversations, more and more, I have felt incredibly secure whilst feeling really vulnerable. And isn't that what we're aiming for? That we can actually connect and feel secure, as opposed to have to stay in our lanes and feel safe.